And I think the live stream should be going in a second. There we go. We're streaming. Well, welcome everyone. I know people are still making their way in, so we won't really jump in right now, but give a quick introduction. This is 4 Rabbis, Unlimited Opinions, 3 Rabbis edition today. Rabbi Scott Slarsky, the amazing Rabbi Scott Slarsky. For those who don't know him, he's the rabbi over at Saul Mirowitz Jewish Academy. I hope I said that full name right. My kids go there. In fact, all of us have family who have been there, but Scott is dealing with all sorts of illnesses that are happening at school, so was unable to get away to join us online today, sends his regrets, and I know he's going to try to join us another time. So I'm Rabbi Daniel Bogard at Central Reform Congregation. Here with me is Maharat Rori Picker Neiss, the executive director of the JCRC, and Rabbi Jim Bennett of Shiramuth Congregation. So good to be with the 3 of you, or the 2 of you today, the 3 of us. And so without Scott, we thought what we would do today is really talk about what makes St. Louis's Jewish community unique from our perspectives. Each of us has lived in professional or semi-professional capacities in all sorts of other Jewish communities. And one of the things that certainly has struck me as someone who grew up in St. Louis and then has come back is how much I treated St. Louis as the default. And I think we all do. And we often think of our local Jewish experience as being the American Jewish experience. But the reality is that the Jewish American experience is incredibly different, whether you live in New York or Los Angeles or St. Louis, and can't even be sort of reduced down to Midwestern Jewry. I know my St. Louis experience was very, very different than my experience in Cincinnati and Peoria. And Jim, you'll talk about North Carolina a little bit. So that's my introduction. And Jim, can I turn it over to you as our lead off here?
Sure, happy to. And it's good to see everybody. To see the 2 of you and to see virtually, to know that the rest of our participants are joining us and with us today on this miserable, rainy, chilly, late fall, early winter day. I was thinking about, as you asked the question, Daniel, and as you posed the topic for us to explore today, I was thinking about my own experience, which now here in St. Louis crosses almost 4 decades. It was just short of 4 decades ago when I first came to the St. Louis Jewish community as a brand newly minted young Reform rabbi in 1984. And the St. Louis Jewish community to me at that point was not an unknown thing. I grew up mostly in the greater Midwest, although by my definition, Midwest goes from Boston, Massachusetts to Fort Worth, Texas, and many places in between. But most of my childhood and young adulthood was spent in the Midwest. I graduated from high school in Kansas City and Indianapolis. I went to college in Bloomington, Indiana. I went to rabbinic school in Cincinnati for 4 of my 5 years of HUC, other than the year I spent in Jerusalem. So I knew the Midwest, and I knew the flavor of the Midwest. And when I came to St. Louis, part of the attraction of the St. Louis Jewish community was that familiarity, that sense of this was the kind of community in which I grew up and was familiar and felt comfortable. Of course, I always jokingly and not so jokingly said that my list of cities that I was willing to come to as a new rabbi really started with which cities had a Major League Baseball team in them. So St. Louis checked that box as well. But when I reflect back on what I remember most about St. Louis was it was a pretty good sized Jewish community, similar to the size we are today, perhaps a little larger than we are today, and considerably demographically younger than we are today as a Jewish community. But the St. Louis Jewish community was overwhelmingly then, and still is overwhelmingly, non-traditional kind of progressive, liberal, reform, mainstream reform and conservative Reconstructionist Jewish community, which was unusual in the national Jewish communal structures that I had heard about and learned about. But it was similar to what I had experienced in Kansas City and Indianapolis and Cincinnati in particular, a community where most of the Jews in the Jewish community and most of the leadership of the Jewish community aligned with the ideologies of non-Orthodox Judaism, essentially, aligned with a non-halachic, a non-traditional progressive reform and conservative approach to the definition of what it means to be Jewish. And that expressed itself in a couple of key ways that I want to just plant markers next to, and then I'll pass the baton perhaps. I remember being really touched by and deeply grateful for and committed to the strong embrace, the inclusive embrace of the St. Louis Jewish community of people who were not all Jewish. In other words, interfaith families, families in which one or maybe more than one member of the family were not technically Jewish, were not halachically Jewish, were not Jewish at all, but wanted to be part of the kihila. You know, they had married into the Jewish community, they were in the process of studying for conversion or not. And the Jewish community was very inclusive and embracing of them. And that was a dominant theme, was how do we be a Jewish community that has a very broad tent and is very welcoming to people that may not traditionally feel that they're part of the Jewish community. That was something that was important to me as a young rabbi, and it still is almost 40 years later, being a Jewish community that is inclusive and welcoming and has permeable boundaries. And I that was something that was unique then, and I'm proud to say I think it's still unique to this Jewish community. Just to put flesh on that, many, if not most, of the rabbis in the St. Louis Jewish community when I moved here in 1984 and still today were open to and welcoming to interfaith couples and embraced them and included them in congregational life and were willing to officiate at interfaith wedding ceremonies, at least under certain circumstances. And were equally open to other groups that may not have felt that they were traditionally part of the Jewish community. This is 1980s. The LGBTQ community was really struggling then to feel included in mainstream Jewish life. And the St. Louis Jewish community had already made a public statement about inclusiveness when it came to the LGBTQ community. And to a lesser degree, in the 80s, there was an opening, welcoming attitude towards Jews of color and people of color who might not be technically Jewish, but wanted to be part of the community in some way. Those things I think stood out most, not solely, but those are the things that stood out most for me. And I'll pause there. I'm sure I have lots more to say, but that kind of is what jumps to the surface when I think about St. Louis and its place in Jewish life for me.
Thank you. I'd also love maybe a little later to hear reflections on what you see as having changed, because you were here and then you went away and then you came back, which in some ways you encountered two different Jewish communities then. Rory?
Well, I was going to say, I think I'm the only one here who hasn't left and come back, Daniel.
Yeah. I guess, though, I think it's different when you grow up here too, in terms of, I didn't have a real view, or I certainly have a very different view as a Jewish professional encountering these institutions than I did as a kid.
Yeah, no, I hear that. No, and it's so interesting to hear your stories, Jim. And I did not grow up in the Midwest. I did not feel Midwestern in any way. I don't think I even knew what the Midwest was, broadly speaking, other than like a term that people sometimes use to refer to something. So it's interesting, as I'm listening to you, there's two streams of thought that are going through my mind. And one is just like the profoundly different experience that I have being in St. Louis compared to where I had grown up in New York. And then also what I see as a Jewish communal professional in St. Louis and some of the opportunities and advantages that come with it. And so maybe I'll try to touch a little bit on both of those. So I grew up, I think I've shared a little bit in this group, but I grew up in Brooklyn in a pretty big, not just a big Jewish community, but a big Orthodox Jewish community. And I obviously knew there were other streams of Judaism, and I knew there were other kinds of people, but it was something I was exposed to, but there was just like so many people that you didn't have to ever kind of break out of it, right? I mean, that's the thing that to me, and I think about that a lot of like what we're pushed to here of being in a smaller community. I know not everyone really does play nicely, but it feels like there's much more of this need to, in a way where, I sort of joke about it. Where I was growing up, there at one point a congregation was built across the street, a synagogue was built across the street, and then across the street from that, another synagogue was built, and then that synagogue had a breakaway where then like to the other corner of our block, and so we had 3 synagogues all one street across from us, and the synagogues would split over things like I think the synagogue that those split was because there was a debate between whether they should have tables and chairs versus pews. But there were congregations where it was about like, if you wore colored shirts or you only wore white shirts, or, whatever kinds of like pronunciation of words or things like that. And you can, and I laugh about it because I find it absurd, and I found it absurd then, but you can do that if you have enough Jews to sustain it. Right, there was one congregation where everyone knew that you would always get, every 5 minutes there was another minyan for mincha, right? And here we're talking about a minyan was only Orthodox men. We're not even talking about it in an egalitarian context and or a pluralistic context, but it was sort of like everyone knew, and so you just went. And my understanding, because I never went because it was all men, but was like you'd go and you would just kind of like, if there was already a minyan going on, you would just sort of stand in this other corner, and eventually like 9 other people would join you, and then you would start. And then, it would take like about 5 minutes for that to happen. And so I remember my dad and my brothers, if ever we like had like a dinner we needed to go to, or we were, whatever it was, like you knew that you went there because whatever time you needed, you could find a minyan for. And so on the one hand, there's this sort of like beauty that emerges from this like huge vibrancy of you can create like just about anything that you want. But at the same time, there was also a lot more siloing that happened, because you could always find 10 other people or 50 other people or 100 other people who wanted exactly what you wanted. And so you didn't have to make nice with anyone else. You didn't really have to like negotiate or really have a conversation about what you wanted, because not only could you find enough people to support you, but there was someplace else for that person to go. So it wasn't like, oh, this person needs a Jewish community, so we need to find a space to be welcoming. If you didn't like that person's custom, there was another congregation. Like you didn't owe anything to them. I would walk past, I don't even know how many congregations when I would go to Shabbat morning services, because, those weren't the ones I wanted to go to. And it was still maybe a 10 or 15 minute walk, probably not much longer than the walk I do now to go to Beis Ave. But you'd pass all these other ones and you'd see other people walking in the other direction. And that was fine, because you could really find what you wanted, but it meant that there wasn't really any collaboration or any sense of real relationship happening between groups of people. And so for me, I think what I found most striking of moving to the Midwest and coming to St. Louis to take the job, first working at Beis Ave, and obviously now I'm at the JCRC, were all the things that kind of come along with being in a smaller Jewish community. So I don't have the same access to kosher food, and I don't have, I don't know. I mean, Target has like plenty of ridiculous Hanukkah stuff right now, but it wasn't like every store was sort of stocked. I mean, like the kosher grocery stores that we had, there was this store, Pomegranate. It's like a Whole Foods, but completely kosher. So you had your deli counter and your cheese counter and your bakery, and right, you can get all of this stuff because you could sustain it. Forget like every type of kosher food and restaurant that I could imagine. But again, like the community has to adjust for that. So I remember we moved to St. Louis, and for 2 weeks, a meal train had been set up to bring us food. And it hadn't even occurred to me, but people had proactively done this for us. And when I got there, sure enough, like I didn't have dinner like the day I landed, with these 2 young kids, and I think Russell was driving our car, so he wasn't even there. I hadn't even thought ahead of like, what am I going to eat? And then someone showed up with dinner. And I needed them to, because the truth is that I don't know what I would have eaten. I don't know where I would have. I mean, I guess there was like Gokul. It was this Sunday late, like Cohen's wouldn't have been open. And so I don't even know what my choices would have been. I had two children while I was in New York, and my third was born in St. Louis. And I think we probably had about like 6 weeks of meal train when Shmaya was born in St. Louis. And in New York, I don't think anyone came and brought us food. And I think I had two friends in LA who like ordered me a pizza from like a local pizza place. And I think one person came to visit and brought bagels. But I think because they knew that I could get food, right? Like, whereas now I realize, like, if somebody needs help or if there's a shiva or whatever, like, we'll all jump in because there's not a lot of options. And so part of what I love also in the work that I get to do through the JCRC and like in working with both of you and is that I do feel that there is much more of a sense of like, we need each other. It doesn't mean that we don't still have a diversity. I've often thought that St. Louis is this great balance of being large enough that we have resources, but small enough that like we can actually access all of them. It's not like we only have one synagogue in town. We still have our choices, but we can't really afford to not know who each other is or to have these conversations, right? Or to make sure. So, like Sheremet might not be the right place for someone, so there's CRC, or CRC might not be the right place and there's Sheremet, but like we're still invested in making sure that that person lands somewhere. And obviously I'm naming those two because those are both of you that I'm looking at. I'm not ignoring all the other congregations that I'm well aware of that some of you might be thinking about. But that for me has been what's been so striking. I remember moving to St. Louis. I can't remember who it was, but people coming over to me and saying, "We're so glad you're here. We need you." And just this feeling, whereas when I was in New York, there was sort of this feeling of like, yeah, there's 6 more of you. Like if you don't show up, like I know 8 other people who are like exactly like they fit your box, right? Like semi-interesting Orthodox woman who likes learning and is willing to talk to other people, like that's not unusual around here, and it wasn't so much that I was an unusual box in St. Louis, although maybe I somewhat am, but it was also just like, we need more people who are engaged. We need more people who bring something to the Jewish community, right? There was really this feeling of like, every person has something to contribute. And that was really exciting for me, both as a professional, but also as a person who lives here, like to know that being here matters. I love that. I love being part of something where, if we weren't here, the community would be different for it. And so oftentimes people will comment to me about how surprised, like, don't I miss New York? And I mean, I mostly miss the food. Like, I'm not going to lie, like really good kosher Chinese food. We can talk about all the different food that I get when I fly back to New York. But I don't miss that kind of like rat race of sort of needing to compete or like sort of prove like what you needed to do as a Jewish person. I like being in a place where I know that what I bring to the community has an impact and that every person matters in what we do.
That's so interesting, Rory. I've never experienced large American Jewish communities. Right, the only large Jewish community I have ever lived in is Israel. And actually, right, that's the other Jewish community we all share as well. Though that is so different that sometimes it's too large of a foil.
Yeah, if I could like add really quickly just to that, like it blows my mind. I don't remember when it was. At some point in our neighborhood, somebody, like one of the congregations, installed an air raid siren. So on Fridays, like 18 minutes before Shabbat, this huge siren would go off. And like and it would go off like 18 minutes before, or maybe 10 minutes before candlelighting, and then at candlelighting. Like suddenly I moved to St. Louis and like I needed to know when candlelighting was. But also there were non-Jewish people in the neighborhood who then suddenly had to live with this air raid siren.
Yeah.
But like it was a fascinating experience also of like what it is to be a minority community when you're actually also a majority, right? Like we were very much a minority, but we lived like a majority. I had to walk further from my house to find a non-kosher restaurant than to find a kosher restaurant. They opened a Subway restaurant, not a Subway in New York Subway, a Subway restaurant in my neighborhood. And they had this huge sign in Subway font, like a Subway font, not just someone wrote on a piece of paper, that said, "This is not a kosher Subway," because people assumed it was kosher, and there were kosher Subways. The 7-Eleven had a big sign that said, "We have Chalav Yisrael milk." Like everything was catering to us, even as we weren't. And so I have this really interesting experience. And so it's interesting for me now, being in St. Louis, where part of my work is also things like fighting anti-Semitism and explaining Judaism to others, because now I'm a minority as a minority in a way that I actually don't think I experienced before this. Like, I only knew what it was to be a majority, where like everyone in the neighborhood, right? Like, didn't matter if you weren't Jewish, you knew what Shabbat was because there was an air raid siren, and you knew kosher food because it was the closest pizza place in the neighborhood. And, you know, you had to know about like when stores were going to close, alternate side parking, like the meters were not in effect on Saturdays, but were in effect on Sundays because it was too many Jews. And so we weren't moving our cars on Saturdays, but we would park our cars on Sundays. Like we were a majority. And so anyway, I share some of those as like examples of like how much I was immersed in a Jewish world, even as I knew that I was a minority within America.
Well, and in the Orthodox Jewish world too, right? I mean, that's the other piece that's so important about the difference. Thank you.
Daniel, I want to hear your take as well, but I wanted to add, Rory made me think about something else that I didn't reflect on in my opening comment. I think what made our experiences dramatically different, Rory, to some degree also, had to do with one of the other uniquenesses of the St. Louis Jewish community, both when I arrived here 4 decades ago and also still today. And I'm going to say this I'm thinking out loud as I'm speaking, so I hope I communicate what I'm trying to say here. When I came here in the 1980s, as a rabbi, as a Jewish professional, there was quite a bit of interaction between the Jewish professional leadership of the community, from the Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionist ends of the community, spectrum of the community, with the more Orthodox Jewish communal leadership. We had a lot of interaction. And I can recall many times when the Reform and Conservative and Orthodox rabbis were at meetings together, worked together on projects in the community. Not everybody, but there was a great deal of intersection between the leadership, Jewish communal leadership in clergy and educators in particular, regardless of stream of Judaism. That was not the case of the community at large. Very few people from my congregation or the other Reform congregations had much to do with people who were more observant or more traditionally aligned, unless they were related, which there's a lot of that, or neighbors or had some personal connection. But there wasn't a lot of intersection between Reform community, Conservative community in particular, and the Orthodox community. There just wasn't a lot of it. And I will say that 4 decades later, I think that's all the more so. And I really regret deeply the absence of serious, other than this conversation and others like it that are intentional, there's not a lot of working together on most community projects between the Reform Conservative and the Orthodox community. There's very little connection, and that is sad to me, really deeply sad. And at the same time, one of the other things that made St. Louis profoundly unique for me, and 40 years ago and still today, was how most Jews, although they would say most of their friends were Jewish, they had many, many, many interactions with people of other faiths, people working because of the nature of, the greater United States. It wasn't Brooklyn, where most people you'd meet on the street were Jewish. St. Louis wasn't and still isn't Brooklyn. And so most of us, and I think many people would say, most of my friends maybe are Jewish, most of them, but I interact a lot with people of other faiths, and we even work together on projects and community enterprises, be they civic enterprises or social justice enterprises with people of other faiths. And there is not nearly as much as I think there should be, shared working and living and being together within the Jewish community, particularly crossing the boundaries of our streams. I just want to plant that flag as something maybe for us to return to a little later.
I also wonder, Jim, how much of the sort of frame of many to most of my friends are Jewish is generational too. I don't know any St. Louis numbers, but just I know nationally and then anecdotally amongst my friends and the folks I grew up with here, I'm not sure that that's nearly as true of my generation and certainly the generations younger than me.
I agree, definitely.
Well, maybe I'll jump in with my other Jewish experiences. The two towns I know the best other than St. Louis are Peoria and Cincinnati. And Peoria, it's interesting, Rory, hearing you talk about the experience of you moving here. That was my experience moving to Peoria. And part of it was we had our kids there too. Let's see. Karen went into labor, I think 2 days after we moved to Peoria. I was in the middle of doing a wedding and I had left my phone in the car and came back and had, 25 missed calls. Thanks to the magic of Google Voice, we actually went back a couple of weeks ago and listened to some of those voicemails. But, and we had endless meal trains and on and on. And writ large, the Peoria experience, where there's only about 1,000 Jews in the very broad metro area, it's so much more of a family because it has to be. You knew everyone basically in the Jewish community. And particularly in a town like Peoria, where most of the folks are transplants, most have come in for a job at Bradley or Caterpillar or what have you. It was a family and everyone took care of each other in a really different way. Now, we had no other Reform synagogue or conservative synagogue for folks to go to. So we had to be everything to everyone, which was amazing and tough at times. One of the things I love being in St. Louis and being at CRC in particular is the ability to be really different and unique and know that there are lots of other options, even just in the Reform Jewish world or the progressive Jewish world, for folks to go to if we are not the right match, which is kind of wonderful. So I do miss that about Peoria, that sense of it being a warm, small hug, almost middle school like at times, in all of the good ways and sometimes in the more intense ways. But the other city that I know pretty well Jewishly is Cincinnati. And, I was at a conservative congregation there, a large suburban conservative congregation. And Cincinnati's Jewish community is about half of St. Louis's population, maybe even a little less than that. But what makes it different is there are these two poles that everything revolves around or did revolve around in Cincinnati's Jewish community. The first was Hebrew Union College and the existence of all of these rabbinical students there. And ironically, in reflecting on it, I think that HUC's reform influence made Cincinnati's Jewish community more lowercase c conservative. Really was a conservative influence. And then the other big one is Cincinnati's Jewish hospital sold and turned into a Jewish foundation for the Jewish community there. I think $1 billion, maybe, I don't know, I'm making that number up now. I knew at some point how much money it was. It was a lot of money, at least hundreds of millions of dollars that they were pouring into the local Jewish community, and it changed everything. There was money available for almost anything you could dream up. But again, in many ways, it created a more conservative, small c conservative Jewish community because there was this centralization, because there was this gatekeeping. Karen and I used to somewhat jokingly talk about the cartel in Cincinnati. But that's the other end of what you were talking about, Jim, too, right? In communities where everyone comes together to work together, there's also something stale that happens as well, because disruption brings about new and wonderful, even as it sort of tears down the old. And that was the piece that really stood out to us in moving to St. Louis, is how much less venerated legacy institutions are here than they were in Cincinnati. And I actually think to our benefit here. I sometimes got the sense in Cincinnati that institutions were being propped up after they had stopped best serving the Jews of Cincinnati. And I think that happens a lot less when you don't have a foundation like that. Now, it would be nice to have, hundreds of millions of dollars infusing Jewish life in St. Louis. But to me, that is the biggest difference is we all know each other. We all get along relatively well, actually, the Jewish professionals, at least that's been my experience in St. Louis. And there's not a pressure to follow a set of communal norms and rules that are enforced from above in quite the same way. Yeah, I don't know how both of you have interacted with that as compared to other cities, but.
Well, I did not work in the Cincinnati Jewish community. I attended school there, and I worked part-time as a student, but I didn't have the same experience that you had, Daniel, being a leader in the Jewish community.
And that was prior to the foundation also.
Exactly. In my days, it was quite a bit different. I think pre-foundation days, Cincinnati actually was pretty similar to what I experienced when I moved to St. Louis. I think that, for me personally, that was part of the familiarity of St. Louis. It was like moving west, to a better baseball team and a slightly bigger Jewish community, or a significantly bigger Jewish community. But I think that has changed dramatically. And my colleagues and friends who are in the Cincinnati Jewish community bemoan that to some degree, what you described. I'll just add to the mix here a pretty dramatic difference that I experienced when I moved to the New South in 1993 and moved from St. Louis to Charlotte, North Carolina, which really was at the beginning of emerging as a smaller version of Atlanta, Georgia, in the 90s and early 2000s as a leading and growing Jewish community. It was still kind of just on the beginning of that. But what made Charlotte so unique was a little bit of a different version of what you just described in Cincinnati. A really dynamic shared communal leadership by necessity. Charlotte did something unique that a number of other Jewish communities have tried to greater or lesser extent now, but the entire community came together essentially and pooled its resources and built a central campus, not unlike our campus here in the JCC Federation campus, the Millstone campus, but even broader because it included the synagogues. So they formed what was known as Shalom Park, the Reform conservative community, and the JCC and the Federation and the Jewish Family Service and what was the beginning of a JCRC there. They all came together, pooled their resources, bought one huge piece of land, and everybody built on that land as a communal enterprise. So
What's the population there, Jim? Do you know?
Well, when I moved there, the population was about 10,000. I think the population has more than doubled. They're probably in the mid 20,000 range as a Jewish community. So they're not tiny. They're substantial and they're growing.
That's about the size of Cincinnati's population. They're growing, heading in different demographic directions.
Totally. It's a very young community. It's also just exploding. When I moved to Charlotte in 1993, there were 2 synagogues plus Chabad. So there were 3 synagogues. Now today, I think at last count, there were like 9 or 10 synagogues in the greater Charlotte metropolitan area, which is geographically as large as the St. Louis metropolitan area, and maybe demographically is approaching that same 2 to 3 million range because St. Louis is declining so much. But what was unique, especially about Charlotte, was this shared partnership where everybody, for better or for worse, worked together. The conservative shul, the Reform congregation, the JCC, the Federation, all worked together even to the extent that they had one annual community fundraising event, which they called the One for All Ball. And I think it still happens every other year, I believe, in Charlotte, where instead of every organization having its own annual gala, there was one huge gala and the proceeds were divided different ways over the years, sometimes per capita, sometimes it's some other formula, But instead of everybody raising a little bit of money, everybody raised a lot of money together. And the other neat thing that happened from a philanthropic point of view was many of the members of the wealthiest, most generous members of one congregation or one organization would also support all the congregations. Now, part of that was by necessity because, for example, I had young families in my congregation whose parents or grandparents were members of one of the other congregations in town, and they would support us because they wanted to see a rising tide raises all ships. They wanted to see everybody flourishing. So when we did development projects, we could count on the most generous members of the community, not only supporting their own congregation, but supporting ours as well, and vice versa. There was also, there was a lot of conflict, and I'm sure there still is in that model. There was a lot of times when we fought over everything. We fought over, whether the JCC had to be glatt kosher or kosher under the conservative rabbi's hashgacha or whatever. We fought over what color the lights in the parking lot would be, because my congregational leadership wanted our parking lot lit one color and the conservative congregation wanted a different color, a slightly different shade of yellowish white light in their parking lot. We fought about everything, but those fights were on the basis of a shared vision of we are one community. And I admit, I've been back here now for, close to 20 years. I miss that sense of shared community mission, working all together on projects that are mutually beneficial for all of us. I mean, we have things we work on together, thankfully, the JCRC, the Kaplan Feldman Museum, the Federation, but we don't have the sense of shared community commitment to everybody's mutual benefit. A lot of institutions in St. Louis's Jewish community, I think, feel that we're kind of on our own, except when somebody wants us to work together for the community, for communal things. There's not a sense of everybody's mission is everybody's business, and everybody's mission is in the interest of everyone. And look, I've been back here long enough now to say, when I came to St. Louis in 1984, there were 8 or even 9 Reform congregations. There were 3 conservative congregations, and I don't know how many Orthodox shuls there were. Today, there's only 5 Reform congregations, and there's only 2 conservative shuls. That's a dramatic shrinkage, but also consolidation of our community. And I think there's a lot of worry about just basic survival that's going on in the Jewish communal institutional framework today in St. Louis.
Well, and if I can jump on that, because I think you're bringing up so many profound points, Jim. And while I recognize, right, institutionally, we see some shrinkage, but the reality is that our Jewish community, the Jewish population, hasn't been shrinking. I don't know what the next communal study is going to show, but I think we see it nationally that those numbers are not actually declining. What's declining are things like membership. And I wonder to what extent, we become like our own self-fulfilling prophecy, because if all we're concerned about are membership, or if the ways that we recruit members is by bashing on the other guy next door because come here and don't go over there, then nobody really wants to be part of what we're offering either, right? And so to that extent, like, it's not like, right, when we treat the Jewish community like a zero-sum game, then every dollar someone gives to you is a dollar someone doesn't give to me. And every time they attend services at you, they're not attending a program with me. But it's actually not the case, right? You said a rising tide raises all boats. There's so many more people who we can be accessing. And we do see people in our community, and I think not to the way that you described it in Charlotte, but people who are really generous across organizations, and people who are members of multiple congregations, and people who are invested in multiple causes. And oftentimes, I don't know of any situation where someone is giving us their last dollar, right? If they're making a donation to you, usually it's because hopefully they have, the ability to write another check should something else move them, and maybe not, massive amounts of money. And so it just frustrates me that that's become part of our communal discourse, has been like, oh yeah, they're terrible, sort of like we bash on each other sometimes. And I hope not a lot, but I know that's kind of an instinct that oftentimes comes up when actually like the success of any one of our organizations actually could be the success of all of our organizations. I'll just share also, like we just did a theory of change work with the Jewish Community Relations Council. And one of the things that I found really fascinating with our theory of change, and I won't go into, this isn't like my show here, I'm not going to go into all of it, but we actually realized that like part of our preconditions of our theory of change to get to the vision that we're trying to imagine requires not just work that JCRC does, like it requires strong congregations, and it requires a strong federation, and it requires rabbis and congregations to have individual relationships. Like it can't just be the work of the JCRC. We can't do anything that we want if people are not active in congregations. Like there's no Jewish community for us to unite to then whatever all the other work that's happening. And so I'm just like really sitting with, none of us can do this work if the rest of us aren't doing this work.
Well, and just to underscore an exclamation point after what you just said, you know, and this is easier said than done, but more engaged Jews is good for all of us. More engaged people in the Jewish community, even those who are only Jewish adjacent, is good for all of us. And we should all be working together to celebrate that. And well, look, I'd love for everyone to love me and what I do so much that they all want to be part of my community. I'm realistic, and I know, first of all, no one organization can serve all people in all times. But also, I love when I hear that somebody is super involved in their own synagogue or another organization. What I don't love is when people say, I only support what I do. And you know, this divisiveness that has spread across our community in political dialogue as well as in religious dialogue and everywhere else, that's counterproductive to us. We should pride ourselves on the success. We're not sports teams that are in competition with each other. We are in shared enterprises in competition with, you know, bad values. We want to build a world that is filled with good values, and we should be celebrating that together in a community. And I should be happy when another organization or another synagogue grows, and I should support them. That's what I think I'd like to see us moving towards more as a Jewish community, a shared enterprise that is communal.
And I just want to, and sorry, Daniel, I'll let you jump in on this also, but I know we've come back to this thought so many times, but I think the thing that maybe scares me most in our community is when people want to shut down dialogue or cut out people who don't fit their definition of ideas that they want in the community, right? There's this idea that if I can make this untenable, or if I can make this unappealable, then I can define the community in the way that I want to be. But all we actually do is cut a hole in our own boat, to keep going with that same metaphor we were using before. Trying to eliminate ideas or individuals from our community only weakens the entire community, and it doesn't end up protecting any of our organizations. It actually hurts the entire project. And so I know that one of the things that we've talked about a lot in this, and that we really try to do, is create space for a multitude of voices, and wanting to really use that space for people to fill it with those voices, because when people don't feel like they have a place in the community, they leave all of our communal institutions. They don't just leave one, but they really move away from all of it. And we lose out by losing those individuals, and by losing that engagement, by losing that passion, that vibrancy, that enthusiasm. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more at the end also. I'm really excited about how we're bringing in all these other people to join us. And I'm sorry that Scott wasn't able to join us today. But you know, it's really one of the things that actually frightens me, because that's what I see as the greatest cause of decline, is when we start telling people that they're not welcome.
I think the other way that keeps coming into my head of framing so much of what we're talking about right now in terms of the sociological factors that are at play is, I also think this is about the tension between the energy that goes into supporting our institutions and the energy that goes into supporting Jews, whomever they are, and however they're choosing to live their Jewish lives. And I think that's a really easy mistake for almost all of us to make. I mean, Jewish leadership, but also donors and the people who do these sociological studies. And Jewish institutions declining isn't the same thing as Jewish community decline or the offerings for Jews. And, the other story we can talk about in St. Louis is the startup story that has happened here again and again, whether you're talking groups like Matovu, which I know that Russell's really involved in, or even Safaria, which to me is one of the great, we should have Russell on sometime to talk about Safaria too. But
invite him.
Yeah, I think Safaria in some ways is the biggest jump forward since, the Vilna Gaon in terms of how we access Jewish text. And it's got a St. Louis story between Russell and Annie Lumberman, and there's a lot of St. Louis connections there.
Daniel, you should probably tell everybody what Safaria is.
Oh yeah, if you don't know Safaria, head to Safaria, safaria.org. Russell is one of the software engineers there, and it is a way of getting all Jewish text to talk to each other. It's incredible. It's a really amazing rabbit hole to go down, and for me at least has become an indispensable Jewish tool. But we have all of these startups. We have Matovu, we have Ashrenu, we have all of these other groups. We have CRC, right? I work and grew up in a 40-year-old congregation, which is a very different place now, certainly, than it was then. But I also think this willingness and tolerance of the St. Louis community to have disruptive institutions to its model is one of the great benefits that we have for Jews who live in this town, even as it often causes Jewish leadership who almost definitionally are invested in the survival of their institutions to pull out their hair and feel like the sky is falling. But I don't think the decline of our institutions is the sky falling. I actually think it can be a really positive change, right? If they're declining, often it's because they're not serving people in the ways that people today want to and need to be served. And that's great, right? Like the work that they did serving people a generation ago is wonderful. And it doesn't mean it has to last forever as an institution. But we get into that mental trap sometimes, I think, too.
And that has to do exactly, I couldn't agree more. And that has to do with how we define the boundaries of our organizations, how we define membership, how we define our mission. And, I increasingly believe that the more open we make our boundaries and our borders of our Jewish community and elsewhere as well, throw that in for the sake of, making a point, that the more open we make our borders, the more we welcome others, the better, the more effective we are at accomplishing our goals. So, why would any of us say no to somebody who wants to participate Jewishly, who wants to study, learn? And that's what, metaphorically, that's what Safaria does. Safaria, creates this open source space where anybody can have access to any Jewish text for free, or hopefully they won't, hopefully they will want to support the project and donate to the project. And the same is true of our synagogues. Why would we not make everything we do, ultimately, if we can figure out a way to do it, make everything we do free and hope that people will want to help support the organizations? That's a new model. And I think the model going forward is going to look increasingly like that for Jewish communities to thrive. I always say this when I talk about this subject, back in the day, the synagogues did not charge for people to come pray or to come study Torah or to participate in Jewish communal life. Synagogues were places where everybody came and gathered, and people gave to support it because they were proud of it and they wanted it to thrive and they believed in it. And I think we got into this weird 19th, 20th century membership model that worked for a while, and I think we're now moving past it. And that may be the case for all of our institutional organizations eventually. It may be that we're going to have to think beyond the conventional wisdom in order to thrive and survive. And I think that means reaching out beyond our traditional boundaries as well. welcoming people who are our neighbors and friends who are not Jewish, but who are curious and want to know, what is it you do over there? And they want to learn, and we should want to learn about who they are as well.
First of all, I'm struck like how much of this is really the Chabad model that we're talking about too. But also I'm struck hearing you know, in Cincinnati, they still have, or still had when I was there, High Holy Day tickets. And right, High Holy Day tickets, at least in the Reform and Conservative world in St. Louis, is unheard of. Right, I don't think there's any congregation that still does tickets, are there, for sale? Yeah. Look, I know a lot of that was, you know, Susan Talvey and having an open place that didn't have tickets, and once you have that market force, it changes things. But yeah, at our congregation in Cincinnati, not only were there tickets, but the tickets in the front cost more money.
I mean, you're talking about a whole new model of our Jewish community, and part of that model, though, requires everyone to. I mean, I feel like this is going back to some of what I was saying before of like, what does it mean to understand that everyone matters, right? It's not just a model of the community where you're passive and it's like, okay, right? Because the idea, I'm not going to try to generalize on this, but we certainly all know that there are people for whom it's like the synagogue needs to exist and the rabbi needs to be there, not because I want to use it on a regular basis, but because one day I'm going to get married and one day someone's going to die and I need a funeral. And so I'm just sort of like holding my spot so that when I call you and say, I need you to do someone's funeral, you don't say, no, you're not a member, right? Like I'm just kind of holding that space. And so that is a model that people kind of have, but what that model presumes is just like, I'm going to need a rabbi to do these things, but I don't actually want to be part of the rest of it. And what I think all of us are saying is like, we actually need you. And so not just like this, because that only works then with like the membership dues and everything else that we're talking about. So, okay, you know, great, hold your spot. We're saying we don't want you to hold your spot. We actually want you to like come in and come to a seat. And that doesn't have to be at services necessarily, but like recognize the value that this offers. And I wonder to what extent we've undervalued, or because we've had so many years of that model of sort of, you have to pay membership dues and you have to pay in, there's been this kind of, right, the pendulum is swinging in the other direction now. And it's all about, well, like, okay, what are the discounts I could get? As opposed to saying, no, what do you actually want to invest in, right? And not just invest in because you might need it, but invest in because who are we as a community? Right? I'm thinking about this a lot. I know now there was the big news about Cone's sale, but when there was talk about Cone selling, right? So I eat kosher food. You all may or may not, right? But like, are you invested in living in a Jewish community where there's access to kosher food, whether or not you're the ones who use it?
Yeah, and that's a fantastic allegory or metaphor for us to talk about, because so many Jews in the Jewish community might say, I don't really care whether Cone survives or not. I don't ever go there. It's not important to me. I don't keep kosher. And yet it is in all of our best interest for there to be places that value kosher food. And thank goodness that Cone's is going to continue. It's mind-boggling to me to understand how a Jewish community of this size cannot support more kosher establishments anyway. That's a conversation for another time, perhaps, Rory, but you're absolutely right that if we value the shared well-being of the whole Jewish community, then we should value whatever it takes in order to make sure that the whole Jewish community can thrive. And there has not, I really bemoan this, that there has not been that shared commitment to the well-being of the whole Jewish community, except perhaps when it comes to our fear of anti-Semitism. You know, our fear of anti-Semitism, our fear of others brings us together. It always has, it always, you know, it's one of the best fundraising tools is out there, you know, our fear and anxieties. But there's no shared similar communal commitment to how do we make sure everybody thrives? How do we make sure our Jewish community, just as a Jewish community, thrives? Even if I don't keep kosher, I want to make sure there's kosher places that those who do keep kosher will be able to enjoy and use, and maybe I should support those myself. You know, I think that's a different mentality And I just wanted to throw this in the water as long as we're talking about this. This whole topic that we've been discussing isn't only relevant to us here in St. Louis. This is, my fear is what's happening across the ocean in Israel right now is making even more clear my version of Judaism is the only legitimate version mentality. And I can exclude others from Jewish life if I choose to. That's what I see happening in the newly formed government in Israel. I think that itself should be a topic for us to return to in one of our upcoming conversations.
Yeah, I don't know if either of you saw the Jerusalem Post ran a Twitter poll. Did you see this? They pulled it, but ran a Twitter poll asking, should Reform Jews / women be allowed to light a Chanukiah at the Kotel, the Western Wall? Right, it's mind-boggling. I mean, first, the damage, even just to ask a question like that, to put that out into the Jewish conversation, but that is a part of the conversation that's happening too, is the reality, whether it's that specific issue or not, that we're seeing more and more.
And look, there's a fear of change in whatever way, right? Like somehow, like, I think we all have it, right? We all have this like community that we want to see. And for me, I think my bigger fear is what's at risk, right? That's, I think, like sort of what we also have to hold on to. But for some people, it's just like, if I could set up these really rigid guidelines, or I can say, I mean, I don't even totally have the words for it, because look, this is like what scared people when I was interested in getting more engaged in Judaism. It was like, I think I wrote this op-ed actually a few years ago. The OU made another announcement about women not being allowed to be in leadership positions or clergy positions, whatever they did. And I was asked if I would write, I think it was JTA, maybe it was the New York Jewish Week, I can look it up. I was asked to write a response, and I said, like, can I just say, I can't believe we're like, this is the biggest problem that you think we have? And they were like, yeah, but make it 800 words. But basically, like, that was really the summary of what I said. It was like, I wish that the biggest problem facing our Jewish community was that women want to study Torah, or women want to light Hanukkah candles. Like would that was actually what was keeping all of us up at night, right? Like if like on the list of things, if we want to worry about like forget all of like the abuse scandals that we can talk about and everything else, right? And like infighting and access to Jewish education and the rising costs of living and people who are living below the poverty level in our Jewish community. And like, we can keep going on and on. And like, I wish that the biggest thing that we were worried about was, women wanting to light Hanukkah candles. But by the way, I also wish that the biggest thing that we needed to worry about were, Jews who don't agree with me. Like, if that was really the only thing that was keeping me up at night, and whether that's through Jewish practice or whether that's around Israel, like all of these things, like, I just think like we don't have the room to keep cutting people down on this. And all we're doing is, I think, the number of people who look at this who don't care if women light Hanukkah candles and are just like, this is dumb. Judaism has nothing to say about my life, because if that's what Judaism is spending its time on, when I want to talk about climate change, I want to talk about democracy in America, I want to talk about access to healthcare, I want to talk about economy, I want to talk about if I have a job, I want to talk about what the world is going to look like for my kids and my grandkids. If the only thing Judaism has to talk about is like who's allowed to light Hanukkah candles, then give me something else instead. And I don't blame them. I feel like that half the time. So I wish that was actually the problem that we needed to talk about. And I think for me, like, all of these are the reasons why I've invested so much of my career in saying, like, how do we make this space? Not because, like, I love having these conversations with both of you, and I love what you bring to the community, not because it's where I am. Like, I've been privileged to be in both of your congregations. It's not the way that I worship, and it's not, what my Shabbat experience is. But I'm so grateful that you make it for the community, because it needs to be about the community. And if this is only about making something that each of us wants, then we're not actually serving the Jewish people. So anyway, that's my rant. I'll get off my soapbox on that.
Amen.
I'm so riled up about it.
Thank you for saying that. I agree.
Jim, unless you have something else, I think we'll end with that. That was such a wonderful summation, I think, of focusing on what's important here, Rory. Thank you. And let me add also, the other difference that I really see here is our JCRC is pretty wonderful here in St. Louis, and so much of that credit goes to you and the work you have enabled. So thank you. Okay.
And I'm gonna put this op-ed in the chat because I found it.
We'll be back next month, hopefully with our guest then. Does anyone remember who our guest is next month?
It will be, I have it. Thought I have it. Next month, January, we're going to be with Rabbi Mason, who just retired from Nusa Hari.
Oh, there you go. Talking about sort of increasing the boundaries of communication here.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about that. And you'll also get more information. I haven't even told you. There might be a new link to this, but we'll send out all the information that you need. And we're excited to find another time. Scott had some really, really interesting topics to talk to all of us about. And he sent, actually, I just want to give him credit because he sent a whole bunch of questions and framing for me, and I just did not have the heart to do it without him. So we're going to make sure to find another time to bring him in, because if he wasn't going to be I didn't want to take all of his work and then just benefit from it. And
more people should know the amazing Scott Slarsky too.
Agreed. And in the meantime, can we just wish everyone Chag Urim Sameach, a happy Hanukkah, the festival of light. May everybody's winter dark days be filled with light and warmth and lots of love and communal working together and increasing light in the world around us.
Amen.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.